Hey, Larry here. Welcome to the second edition of this documentary about my life. And first off, my time in the military. That is the first question, about all my time in the military. So thank you for tuning in from sunny skies in Chiang Mai, Thailand. Okay, so last time we left off, this is edition 2, part 2. Of my time in the military. So, just a quick little review of where we left off last time. I had, gotten a letter from the Army about reporting to Fort Lewis and all that, and then I had 14 days left. My friend who was in the same situation as me called me up, said get to the Navy recruiter. Navy recruiter said we could join the Navy full-time, regular Navy for 4 years, and we could be in San Diego in boot camp in 7 or 8 days from then. And we had 14 days left at that time before we had to report to Fort Lewis. So I said, where do I sign? I mean, this was right out of heaven, right? Unbelievable. And so we signed up, and we went to San Diego as promised, and we went to boot camp. Wasn't much of anything in boot camp compared to the Army. It was like being on vacation in Bermuda. It was no big deal. So, after boot camp, which I started August 23rd, 1968, and I was 19 years old. So after boot camp, we went home on leave for, I don't know, maybe 14 days, something like that. And so then I flew from Portland back down to San Diego and went back to find out, well, actually, I think before we left boot camp to go on leave, I think we did get our orders. And because when we went back, we were going to check in where we were going to be stationed at. Yeah, I think that's the way it worked. So just before we left on leave, everybody got their orders, and we all thought, we're going to a ship or whatever. So I was in the aviation part of it. I was an Airedale, they called us, and so I figured, well, I'll probably get put on a carrier or something. And I got stationed at NAS, Naval Air Station, Miramar, California, and I didn't know what that was. I'd never heard of it, but of course I found out right away that it was just up the street from where I went to boot camp at Camp Nimitz in San Diego there. It was not that far away, and it was a naval air station, and that's where I was going to be stationed in VF 121. That was the name of the squadron I was going to be attached to, and I didn't really know, what that was for sure, but I knew where I was going to have to report to. So I went home, went on leave, went back to San Diego, went to Miramar Naval Air Station, and reported in to VF 121 on the base at Miramar. So I'm 19, and this is would have been September of '68. So life on the base at Miramar was actually pretty different than a lot of places in the Navy at that time, because it was a naval air station. It was a high-profile naval air station. There were celebrities that came and visited there once in a while. Ronald Reagan came and visited once or twice while I was there. When the ship, I can't remember the name of the ship, was it USS Butcher, or I don't know, maybe that was the captain's name, I can't remember, but it was that ship that got hit somewhere over by North Korea or something, and it was a big deal, and some of the crew got injured, maybe one got killed or something, I can't remember, I didn't look it up. It's been a long time ago, but when that crew was shipped back to the States, they landed at Miramar, and Reagan was there to meet them, and you know, we were at work on the flight line, so you know, we went up to the top of the hangar and watched the plane land and watched these guys get off. Some of them were wrapped, bandaged up, limping and all that, and Reagan was there to meet them and all that. So it was kind of a high-profile base, so it was a little bit laxed on, you know, protocol. And because I worked up on the line, that is the line of aircraft, is where I was going to be working. And so VF 121 turned out to be a training squadron, and eventually VF 121 became Top Gun after I had left. So it was a training squadron, which meant that the brand new pilots that trained in Pensacola on the smaller jet, I don't know, it was a T-28, or, you know, it was a small jet trainer that the Navy pilots trained on in the beginning of their flight training. Once they graduated from there as a second lieutenant, which was their first bar, commission bars on their hat and everything, you know, then how many ever of them would come to Miramar that were going to be carrier pilots stationed on an aircraft carrier. But first they had to come to the training squadron, VF 121, to be trained on F-4 Phantoms and qualify to go to a carrier-based squadron. So the training, man, can't remember if it was like something like 12 weeks or something. You know, it wasn't super long, but it was very intense. And the thing was is that up by the hangars and the flight line, you didn't have to salute any officer, because there were so many officers there, pilots always around, and the workers, us, enlisted men, that you'd be saluting all the time. That's all you'd be doing. And so the rule was you didn't have to salute up on the flight line and around the hangars there. So it was always kind of funny when the first batch of second lieutenants would show up. You know, this was their first assignment to a base as a commissioned officer and a pilot and all that, so they were pretty cocky and, you know, thought they were, you know, Top Gun or something. And so when they first showed up, you know, they'd walk around and, you know, we'd just walk by them like they weren't there. And of course they'd go, excuse me. And we'd turn around and go, sir? And they said, didn't you notice that I'm an officer? Yes, sir, I did. Well, isn't it customary to salute an officer? I said, well, yes, sir, it is, but I don't know if you got the memo, but around the hangars and up on the flight line, we don't have to salute officers because that's all we'd be doing all day. And that's the rule here. And so, I don't know, maybe you're new here. Are you new here? Because that's the way it is. Yeah, yes sir, that's the way it is. So that was always kind of fun. And so VF-121 was not a carrier-based squadron, it was a training squadron. And that's all they did. They went through the 12-week program or whatever it was, and then that group would move on. Either they'd qualify for carrier squadrons or not. If not, they'd go fly whatever, but not on a carrier, because it was not easy to qualify for that. Not too many actually did. So when the class graduated and that was over, we'd get a new class, and we just rotated through, and that was our job as a training squadron. So I was what they called a plane captain, which was a brown shirt when we worked on the flight deck, when we did go out to a carrier. So the plane captain's job was basically working on a flight line, and we weren't trained in a specific area, you know, like maintenance or, you know, hydraulic systems or, you know, ejection seats and whatever. We weren't trained like that in a specific area of the aircraft. So we were trained in a general sense that our job was to go out to an assigned aircraft before the launch. And, you know, it was on a board every day which aircraft we were assigned to. And and the launch time. So we'd go out a couple hours before the launch, and we would do a pre-flight. And so that consisted of, you know, checking oil, places, checking oxygen levels for the oxygen tank, checking for hydraulic leaks, checking for general overall condition of the aircraft. We'd get this little ladder, step ladder thing, and we'd go up and crawl into the intake, and we would check for FOD, foreign object debris, and so we'd crawl down in the intake back to the engine and make sure that there was nothing in that intake that could harm the engine. You know, I mean, nothing there. So, and then we'd get in the cockpit and we would go through turn on the instruments and make sure all the instruments were, lighting up and working, and, we'd do a whole routine in the cockpit. So I'll show you here just for the fun of it. I don't have a lot of pictures anymore of my time at the base, but this was a picture that I think this was on land. I don't think it was on a carrier, but this was a picture of me and a paisano friend of mine from New York or wherever, doing a pre-flight, and I was sitting in the cockpit there. So that was in probably 68, 69. So we did the pre-flight, and in case we found anything wrong, we could call the specialty group of people to come and fix whatever the problem was. If it was electronic or hydraulic or whatever, we could have time to get maintenance done on the aircraft. So then we'd wait around and some of the things we could do ourselves, like the liquid oxygen. If it was low, we could go down to the ox farm where they refilled all the bottles of oxygen, and we could take the empty down and bring the full one back and stick that in and hook it up. There were certain things we could do ourselves that we were trained to do. So that was the pre-flight. So then, when it came time for the launch, the pilots came out, usually about 20 minutes, 25 minutes early, and they'd do a walk around of the plane from the outside, and we'd walk around with them, answer any questions they had about, some hydraulic little leaking fluid or, whatever, or they'd ask about something or whatever. And then they would climb up into the aircraft, a pilot and a RIO, a radar instrument operator, who sat in the back. So the pilot flew the plane, the RIO ran the radar instruments and everything for ordnance, for fighting. So once they got in their seats, then we would help them put the straps up over their shoulders so they could hook them up. We'd help them with, whatever else, they needed right at the moment. And we had already unpinned the ejection seat. There was like 7 pins, I can't remember exactly how many, that went into different places on the ejection seat for safety. And so you could pull all those pins except for one right up on the back of the seat. In that picture, you can see there's a red bag right there on the back of that ejection seat. And so that one pin you would leave in the top of the seat, and that was the pin that if it was in, the ejection seat would not fire. But as soon as that pin came out, now the ejection seat is live. And if they pull the handle, out they go. So before they came up and got in the plane, you'd undo these other pins and stick it in the bag and just leave the one hooked up. And so once you got them in and they were ready to go, they'd ask for the pin. So you take the pin out of the back of the seat, put it in the bag, hand them the bag, and they'd put it somewhere there. And that way they knew and confirmed that their ejection seat was hot. It was ready to fire. So then we'd go out and, you know, whose ever turn it was to do whatever on the plane. A couple guys would be working underneath the plane to button up doors, and, you know, because you hooked up air to a machine, a huffer, to blow through and start the engines. And so if you were out front, you were given signals and directing the startup. You know, you were doing the different signals for the rudder, and then unfold the wings and chocks, you know, and then taxi them out and all that stuff. So you learned all that stuff, and it was great. It was fun. I loved working around the fighters, the jets. You know, it was good. I loved it. And so you'd start them up. You'd go through all the checks and do all the stuff, and then you'd taxi them out and send them on their way. And the flights usually lasted for about an hour or so. And then when they came back in, you knew which place they were gonna park by numbers. So you went out and you were stationed either out where they first came down the line, or you were out in front where they were gonna park and stop. And so you would, you know, you direct them in to the parking place, you know, stop, chocks, cut the engines and all that. So, and then when they got out, you'd help them, you know, put the ladder down from the fuselage, and you'd go up, and they would hand you the red bag. You'd take the ejection seat hot pin, and you'd put it in the place on the top of the seat, and that secured the seat from any accidental ejection. And then you'd take whatever, help them out, and then as soon as they got out, you'd go up and pin the rest of the seat, and you'd do a post-flight. You'd check everything out again, check all the levels, oxygen, oil, hydraulics, and look around to see if there was any damage, and did they write anything up that needed to be fixed. And that was the post-flight. And that was basically the job. You know, they did have parachutes that drag chutes that came out on the F4s. So when they landed, they popped this back cone out, and a parachute would deploy. And then once they stopped, they'd pull a handle up that would release the hook on the chute, and there'd be a crewman. There'd be one of us out there to pull on the chute, to pull the hook up out from the plane. And then, you know, they'd take the chute and go repack it, and part of our job was putting that pack back in the back of the plane, and some of them it was easy, some of them it was terribly hard to shut the door and all that if they weren't packed right. So, you know, there were things here and there. I felt good. It was a job I liked, because I was interested in becoming a pilot, and anyway, not a fighter pilot, but just commercial pilot. And so I loved the job. You know, it was perfect. And, you know, we just did it every day, and you know, it worked good. And, you know, I was super happy. And then, and I don't know if I said this already or not, because I might have got the times messed up here. But I'm sure it was after I had started, working the squadron there, that one day they called everybody to muster up, outside the line shack. So we were all in this line, and it was just a long single file line, it was just a wide line, just one line, not stacked up in lines, it was kind of different. And they introduced these guys. There was 2 or 3 of them, and they came out, and they had a megaphone thing, and they said, they introduced themselves, and they said, "Hey, we're here looking for volunteers." Volunteers. Well, I had learned from people in the military before me that whenever somebody said the word volunteer, you instantly wanted to take one step backwards. To stay out of the line that was going forward, to volunteer. So they said, "We're looking for volunteers. We're looking for volunteers for helicopter door gunners in Vietnam. And we're looking for people to work on the riverboats in Vietnam. And the deal is, it's a 9-month tour of duty, 9 months. And at the end of your 9 months, you'll be honorably discharged from the U.S. Navy. And you won't have to do another 3 years." Helicopter door gunner and riverboat patrol. Volunteers. We're looking for volunteers. That's all. Well, I kind of knew the life expectancy of a door gunner was probably about 2 or 3 days, and on the riverboats wasn't real good either, because you're pretty much a sitting duck out there on the river. So I had already escaped Vietnam once, and I was certainly not going to volunteer just to save 3 years, of being in the Navy and living. So I took a step backwards. And there were some people who, probably thought, "Man, I'm looking at another 4 years of this. This 9 months, I'm in." And there were some volunteers, but that was a weird day, man. Weird day. So, life on the base was basically just normal. You went to work every day. You had a rack in a dormitory that was yours. You had a locker, and so you had your dress blues and all your stuff in this locker, or a couple lockers, whatever it was, and then you had an upper and lower bunk that you were assigned to one of them, and so you stayed there. You had the chow hall, they had everything on that base. It was a very, very well taken care of base. We had an enlisted men's club. You could go drink every day, and they had live music most nights. It was just like having a job, And later on, some of us rented an apartment off base, and we lived off base. We had cars, and we'd drive to work in the morning, and when our shift was done, we'd drive home back to the apartment, wherever it was. It wasn't far from the base. And you know, the beach wasn't far from the base, La Jolla Shores, just super beautiful beach there. La Jolla was a very rich part of San Diego there on the coast where, you know, a lot of movie stars had houses there. Clint Eastwood lived there, you know, a whole bunch of movie people lived there. And it was a very famous beach, this La Jolla Shores, and all the beaches up from there. And so, you know, after work sometimes we'd just throw the boards on top of the car and go surfing, you know, or whatever. I mean, there was a lot of stuff to do in San Diego. It was a crazy military town and always a lot of stuff going on. And of course that was in the drug days, right? The hippie movement was in full swing, and it was a big deal. Of course, we were in the military, so it was, you know, we couldn't really live the hippie lifestyle at that time, but, you know, on the weekends, we could put on a wig. Yeah, a lot of us had wigs, long hair wigs. And so we put on a wig and, you know, a little more of a hippie outfit. Of course, our dungarees, you know, our pants were bell bottoms anyway, and so there were a lot of people trying to buy our bell bottoms in those days because that was the preferred kind of bell bottom to have was our Navy, you know, issue bell bottoms. So we had the bell bottoms, and then, you know, we'd put on a wig, and you know, we'd kind of fit right in with the hippie crowd, go to concerts and whatever. I didn't really, in the beginning, you know, the first year or so, I didn't do any drugs or anything like that, but later on, you know, because of the ships coming back from Vietnam and stuff, they brought a lot of weed with them and hash and all kinds of stuff, and so that did get to be an issue after a while, and some people were getting caught with drugs just because in the beginning they just give you it wasn't like a dishonorable discharge, it was called it something else. It was kind of I can't remember what they called it, but it wasn't an honorable discharge, and it wasn't a dishonorable discharge. It was kind of an I don't know, unsomething discharge where, you know, they didn't want you in anymore because, you know, you were selling drugs, doing drugs, whatever. Later on, it became a court martial and you went to prison, so that kind of stopped that way of getting out. And they were growing marijuana right outside the barracks. There were bushes, you know, that were hedges that were growing outside the barracks, and, you know, you could plant marijuana plants right behind those, and they'd grow up, and you know, nobody'd even notice them. So, you know, it was a time when all that stuff was going on, and there was a lot of it going on with military personnel. Another thing we did was detachments. That's where we would travel to another base or out to a carrier or wherever they wanted us to go as part of the training of the pilots that we had for the course that we were in for the 12 weeks. So every 12 weeks, there would be detachments to Yuma, Arizona, to a Marine Air Station there, and they would practice bombing runs out over the desert. They would have tires set up in circles with, you know, they'd set them on fire, and so you could see the fires burn. It'd be a big circle, and for the nighttime runs, and then in the daytime, you know, you could just see the black circles on the ground. And we also had their T-28 Trojan single engine prop trainer that the Navy used, and we had one there, and you could sign up, and if your name came up during, you know, your detachment, you could go up and fly on one of the bombing missions, not in the fighter. Well, you could in the fighter too, but there was a long list, and I never made it. It never got to me, so I never got to go up in the F-4. But I went up in the T-28 several times, and we would just fly around in a circle. And then I had a notebook and a tablet, and I'd have the aircraft number, and then, you know, I'd watch as they came down and did their bombing run, and then I would I'd put on the paper where the bomb hit, you know, in the circle or outside, or they missed, or wherever it hit. And so we'd fly around there for about an hour during these bombing run practices. And Yuma was hot, man, it was hot. You know, at 8 o'clock, you know, it was 80. At 9, it was 90. At 10, it was 100. At 11, it was 110. And, you know, and above. And it was a concrete flight line, and your boots, you couldn't stand still. You had to keep lifting one foot, and then the other foot, and then the other foot. And then you had these lines of aircraft that were all starting up and blowing hot exhaust on you if you were out in front of another one. It was incredibly hot. And, you know, we'd go from launching some aircraft, we'd go down to the little canteen, and you know, we'd get a liter bottle of Coke and a tall plastic cup full of ice, pour the Coke in, fill that whole thing up, and drink the whole thing in one shot, and buy another Coke and ice and take back to the line check. And so we'd stay in Yuma for, the detachment usually lasted, what, like 6-7 days, you know. I mean, we were there a little while. But it was nice there. They had irrigation canals that ran all around out there in the desert. And so sometimes in the evening, you know, we'd go out and just kind of camp out there along the canals and catch carp and barbecue them with baked potatoes. And, you know, we just do that kind of different stuff, you know. And there was not far from Yuma, there was a town, I can't remember the name of that town, and it was on the Mexican side. And so sometimes, you know, people would go and jump across, you know, just, it was okay, it was legal and everything. You just cross the border and go into this town, and it was, you know, a pretty wild town, kind of like Tijuana. Not as bad as Tijuana, but you know, kind of. So, you know, there was always stuff going on in Yuma. But you didn't want to go in the summer because it was too stinking hot. You wanted to go in the winter. But it was seniority based, so when you first got to the squadron, guess who went to Yuma in July and August? Me. Later on, I only went in December and January. So we went to those kind of detachments, and then if there was anything else in between that, you know, happened. One time, this was right from Miramar, there was a couple of aircraft that a couple years before I got there had crashed on Santa Catalina Island, just west of Laguna Beach, below LA, and it was was up pretty high on the mountain there, and they just left the planes, you know, crash there. There was nothing that nothing they could really do. You know, they got the bodies out and all that, but small aircraft kept calling in that there was a crash on the island, and so, you know, it turned out to be the same wreckage all the time. So they wanted to clear out the biggest pieces of the wreckage so that, you know, they wouldn't have this problem. So they asked for volunteers one day, and this was something that I did volunteer for because it was, you know, it was local. And so they flew us out to Santa Catalina Island on a twin CH-47 Chinook helicopter, the twin-bladed ones. Noisy. Even we had our ears on, our covers on our ears, and it was still, you couldn't hardly hear yourself think, you know. And then they'd land up on this little, just barely wide enough to land on, and then we'd bust out the back, and then we had to crawl down this cliff, and I mean, it was steep, with these cables, and then we wrapped these cables around part of the fuselage, and you know, tighten them up and put a lock thing in, and it was hooked, and then they'd hook it up to the Chinook helicopter, and then when we told them it was okay, they'd take off and they'd pull these big pieces of wreckage out, take it out over the ocean, drop it off in the ocean, just let it sink. You know, we did that for like 4 or 5 days, and they brought us up, you know, lunches and stuff. So that was pretty cool. And then the other thing we did was carrier detachments, and so these were pretty interesting, because at a certain point in the training, toward the end, they had to go out to an actual carrier, and they had to qualify for landings on the carrier to be able to pass that test to go on to a carrier-based squadron. Because if you can't land on the carrier, you're not going to a squadron on a carrier, because you're not going to be always close enough to land to go back to land if you can't land on the carrier. So the whole crew, how many ever pilots there were, I can't remember how many there were in a class. There was quite a few, and so they would fly us over to a naval air station in Jacksonville, Florida, and they'd fly us on a P-3 Orion 4-engine turboprop, and then we would get on a UH-1N Huey helicopter, and we'd go out about 80 miles to whatever carrier was back from Nam to get reloaded with bombs and stuff. And it was usually the Ranger or the Kitty Hawk. Those were the two that I usually went on. And so, you know, on the way out there, and then they're not flying real high, you know, I mean, they're only, you know, I mean, I don't even know if we got to 1,000 feet. And at some point, you can't see any land in any direction, and you're on this little Huey, and there's nothing but ocean in every direction. It's a little weird. So finally the carrier comes into view, we land on the deck, and you know, we bust out of there and go, you know, do all the stuff to get our quarters and our bunk and all that. And these carriers, they're humongous, and there's like 3,000 people on this thing, and there are so many decks and so many passageways and so many places. I mean, you get lost on that thing, and you may never come out. There have been people who were stationed on these carriers, for their whole time. Maybe they spent 20 years. And when they got out, they're talking to somebody in a bar in San Diego, and they asked them what ship they were on. Well, I was on the Ranger. Yeah, I was on the Ranger. Same time, same dates. They've been on there for 20 years together and never even bumped into each other. Would have never known they were on there. It was like a maze. Pretty intimidating, actually. But there was only certain routes that I had to go. I had to get to my bunk. I had to get to the mess hall. I had to get to the flight deck and the hangar bay. And so once you learn, how to get to 4 or 5 places that you only need to go, well, then you're pretty much in tune. It was exciting, to be sure, because a flight deck is one of, if not the most dangerous places to work in the world, because you have aircraft landing, you have aircraft taking off, there's always movement on the deck, moving around, planes are taxiing, they're being chained down, they're being refueled, they're being pre-flighted, they're moving around, they got exhaust blowing out, they got intakes that'll suck you up, and so, you either get sucked up or blown overboard or whatever. And they showed us a lot of videos where, especially that one where that guy got sucked up into the engine, and that was pretty brutal. And then people get blown over, and so a lot of the ships had these cargo nets that went out 10, 15, 20 feet from the sides, that might catch somebody if they got blown over. And in the daytime, it was one thing because you could obviously see a lot better. And, but sometimes you had to walk underneath aircraft that were taxiing to get to where you needed to go. And sometimes you had to carry these big tie-down, lockdown chains, over your shoulders. And then you had to, get under these aircraft. Well, the F-4s were pretty high, so it wasn't super hard to get under those. But other aircraft like F-8 Crusaders and stuff were so low you couldn't get under. And so you had to, maneuver around them or wait for them to get far enough away. And so it was a head on the swivel kind of thing. You had to be looking around. You had to be aware of where you were and what's going on. And that was a little intimidating at first. After a while, like anything, you kind of get used to it, but you don't want to get lax and lazy, because then that's the time when something will bite you in the butt. So that was very exhilarating. And then at nighttime, it was even worse, because now they have these red lights on for the night vision thing, and now you're out there, and it's pretty dark, and the lights are on the aircraft and all that, but it's a whole different world. And so I guess I never felt like really afraid, but I felt a tremendous respect for the flight deck. And I was a brown shirt on the flight deck. That's plane captains. They had different colored jerseys that you wore, brown, green, yellow, whatever for whatever job you did, and that distinguished everybody, for what they were supposed to be doing. Pilots could see who's who, because we had to taxi them around, on the deck, to fuel them and all the stuff that you have to do. And then there was the hangar bay, and sometimes we worked in the hangar bay. If our plane was down for maintenance, we might go down and have to wash it with waterless cleaner, and that was kind of a brutal job. But so, the first time on the carrier, I was pretty overwhelmed. I was very overwhelmed, and it was just like, well, you're gonna go do this, but you're not sure of everything, but it's kind of baptism under fire, right? So the first time for all this was pretty intimidating. Yeah, it was pretty intimidating. Once I got used to it, and I kind of knew the gist of how things worked, then it became a lot easier. My bunk, when I first got on the first time, after flight operations, went to chow, went to the bunk, and my bunk was up on the top level of 4 or 5, whatever it was, high. And then there's not much room in between, okay? You can barely turn on your side, your shoulders touching the bottom of the bunk above you. But I was on the top one, and I had no idea where I was, related to the ship. And so I got in that bunk the first time, and I'm laying there and I'm dog tired, and I'm laying there and I'm almost asleep, and all of a sudden, bam! I'm like, what in the world? What was that? I couldn't believe it. And then it was like there was this loud bang, and then bump, 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 all this noise. I'm like, what the heck? And then a little while later, I thought, well, whatever. So I'm relaxing a little bit, and bang, another one. Well, I found out that my bunk was right below the flight deck, and I was about at the third cable on the flight deck, that they were trying to catch the second or third cable. And so when they were coming in to land, they were slamming into the deck right above my bunk, and that's what the tremendous noise was. So that was a little bit of a wake-up call. One time we got on a carrier at Alameda up by San Francisco, and we sailed out into the Golden Gate Bridge, but we had to wait for the tide to be just right, because if it was too high, the mast of the ship would hit the bottom of the Golden Gate Bridge. So they had to wait for the tide to be low enough that we could still get out but not hit the bridge. And I remember standing on a fantail going under the bridge, and it looked like we were gonna hit it from where I was. But looking off the back, you could see the mud and junk being dug up by the props, because we were that low to the bottom. And so we were out on the Pacific side for a couple weeks of carrier quals. A lot of the pilots didn't make it, but we were close enough to land that they'd have to go back if their fuel was getting low. And they had to do 3 night traps, and they had to do 3 daylight traps. They call them successful landings. and some of them they just couldn't make it. You know, they were just too afraid to come in soon enough to catch cable. Never did catch cable. Washed out of the program. So all the training was for that. So I suppose, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in all this, but that was the basics of you know, my whole time in the Navy. And on May 8th, 1970, I'm 21 now, I was discharged because the Navy was giving some early outs to some people, and my name was on the first list posted. There were so many people trying to get into the Navy because of Vietnam that there was too many people, and so they started giving some early outs. I got like an 8-month or early out or something like that. And my name was on the list. My friend come out and said, "Dude, they're giving early outs and your name's on the list." I'm like, "What?" "Yeah, come look." I went in the line shack, there's my name. Early out, 8 months early out. Holy cow, where do I sign, right? Well, then I had to go talk to the re-enlistment guy. And, you know, they were offering $5,000 to ship over for another 4 years, re-enlist for another 4 years, $5,000. I'm like, yeah, I don't think so, you know. But there were guys signing up, you know, take the $5,000, went down, bought a new Corvette, drive back to the base, and they say, "Look at my car, look at my car." So what? You're gonna pay 4 years of your life for that stupid car? So, you know, they tried a few times, and I said, "Yeah, no thanks, you know, yeah, no thanks." So then I had to report to the Navy Reserves in Portland when I got out, because, you know, I had a 6-year obligation, right? And I really didn't want to go because I didn't want to get stuck in another reserve situation. But I went anyway, and I walked in with all my paperwork, and I said, "Okay, here, you know, I just got out of the regular Navy, and I'm supposed to report here to your reserve unit." I showed them my paperwork, and they said, "Look, man, we got way too many people here already, okay? So, bye-bye." I said, "Bye-bye?" They said, "Bye-bye." I said, "You mean I don't have to do anything here at all?" They said, "That's right, bye-bye." And I did an about face and walked out. Free from the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. military. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So, I survived the whole Vietnam mess. I had friends that didn't. I had others that came back and were all messed up. And some committed suicide. Some had just crazy, unfortunate accidents. And it was, yeah, it was something that really soured me on, you know, the government and their worthless wars, useless wars, wasted lives, and not just me, but a whole generation of my age group, you know, became very bitter over that whole Vietnam thing. It was horrendous, it was horrible, the losses of life was horrible, and, you know, like usual. It was all for nothing as far as we were concerned. Now the politicians made money and, did all their corrupt stuff like usual, but for the guy on the ground, for the people involved, it was nothing. It was a complete waste of time, complete waste of lives, and I want to make that point very clear of how unnecessary that whole thing was. Completely unnecessary. Because in 75 or 4, whenever exactly it was, America decided, oh, we're going to leave. We're going to leave. So the North Vietnam, the communists that they were so worried about taking over the South. And here's a country the size of Florida, and the whole American military could not defeat half of the country to the north and keep them from coming into the South? Give me a break. And so, after all that, 58,000 Americans die or more, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese die, landmines and unexploded ordnance still left all over the country in Vietnam, Laos, and many more people are going to die from all this. America decides to leave. Oh, we're leaving. So the North Vietnamese come down, take over the South, and thousands of people try to flee in boats and cross in and get into Thailand or Malaysia to save their lives, and they're met with pirates out in the water that rape the women, kill the men, steal their gold and money that they brought with them, and there's thousands more die out there in the Gulf of Thailand. And so the North comes down, takes over anyway. For what? For what? Okay? That's what it is. And today, what? Vietnam's still communist. The whole country's communist. And a great trading partner with the U.S. What? I thought we didn't like the communists. Oh, yeah, but we can make money. Oh, okay. Now, I've been to Vietnam. I live in Thailand. It's an hour flight to Da Nang. An hour and 15-minute flight from Chiang Mai to Da Nang. We went to Da Nang. I saw the places where there's still airplanes parked in the hangars at Da Nang Airport. That was the busiest airport on earth during the war. I see the pictures of Ho Chi Minh. I see the hammer and sickle. I see the communist flag, when I'm there. And then I went to Hanoi. I went to Hanoi, North Vietnam. And the old guys there looked at me like, I will take you out because you're probably one of those American guys that was bombing the hell out of us back in the war. You're in that age group. And I got some really dirty looks from these guys. The whole country's still communist. You can feel it. You can see it on their faces. It's still communist. But hey, life goes on, right? Well, you better wake up and smell the smoothie. Okay, well, I'm not going to go on any longer on that track because it would only get worse. So, that's the end of episode 2 of this documentary about my life. And the question was, about my time in the military service during those years of Vietnam War was on. So I think I've covered it okay. I will do a conclusion to this if Pete has some follow-up questions after he listens to both of these. I'll do a conclusion thing and address any other issues about this. So, okay, I will end there, and I'll see you at the conclusion if there is one. Bye-bye for now.